Good afternoon or good evening or good morning, everyone, depending where you're joining from. And welcome to the first of three sessions of the panel on South-South relations. This is a panel organized by the DSA study group on the rising powers. This study group is currently co-convened by Rory Horner, who's with us today from the University of Manchester, and myself. Emma Mosley, who's also with us here, will be proud to see that this study group is still alive. She's been one of the colleagues who founded who started this study group a few years ago, and others have been active participants, including Alex, Jenny, Constantine, and others who are here. So thanks all for joining. These sessions focus on South-South relations that include a range of types of activities: policy cooperation, lending, diplomacy, trade, technology transfers, among many other things. And South-South relations are, of course, an important dimension of international development processes and outcomes. Some would argue that they unsettle development in a positive way by challenging existing norms and power regimes, while others would argue that they would exacerbate negative aspects of the establishment and South-North relations. So this panel seeks to answer two questions. One, how have South-South relations been impacted by and shaped responses to the multiple pressures unsettling development, positive and negative? And what is the potential for South-South relations to contribute to build back better or build back completely different, as Sarah Hawkes suggested this morning? So the first session today features papers looking at different aspects of the changing international development architecture and power dynamics within it, including the notion of Southern multilateralism, emerging donors lending, and the politics of trilateral cooperation, where North and South come together. Tomorrow, we will continue this conversation with a morning session at 10 a.m. on the rise and changing footprint of China in international development, and then an afternoon session with a focus on the current context of the pandemic and looking at the impact of COVID on the international affairs of some of the BRICS countries, including in their COVID-related diplomacy, aid, and trade. I should also say that there are several other panels at this conference that are looking at the rising powers, particularly China and its Belt and Road Initiative, and later in the week, Brazil and policy transfers. Today's session has three papers and three presenters, so we'll follow the order of the program and have each presenter talking for about 18 minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A discussion after each paper. And that should still leave us some time at the end for a joint conversation discussion. You should all be very familiar with Zoom by now, unfortunately. So please turn your cameras on if you can. Keep your mic muted if you're not speaking. You might also want to introduce yourself in the chat, starting now, actually. It's nice to know who's in the room with us. And you can write your questions in the chat or your comments while listening to the presentations or at the end. Just please keep this short. And if you want to make a longer sort of comment, I would suggest that you just raise your hand at the end and do so verbally. So to the speakers, I'll be giving you a 2-minute warning before the end of your time, and then time's up, sort of a warning. We'll start with Dr. Indrajit Roy, Senior Lecturer on Global Development Politics at the University of York. Indrajit will discuss whether and how Southern multilateralisms impact the international order, with a focus on the New Development Bank and the IPSA Fund. So Indrajit, I now hand over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Lydia and Rory, for this opportunity. And thank you, everyone, for coming here. A lot of you are people whose work I've learned a lot from. So I'm really, really grateful that you've been able to make it here. I'm, of course, delighted to be able to present this very preliminary work here. And I emphasize very preliminary because it's research I've just started. It's supported by funding from the New Zealand government, which was coordinated by colleagues from at the World Bank. A few musings on how I came to the topic of Southern multilateralism are available at this excellent podcast series called SouthSouth Globalization, which is convened by the Oxford University African Society, and I've just put the link in the chat box. It's a podcast series I highly recommend. I think it'll be of interest to everyone in this room. A growing literature documents the emergence of what is being called a new multilateralism in the post-pandemic context. And of course, prior to it as well, to address challenges of inclusion and sustainability. Situated in the broader context of the changing global order, different strands of the literature have debated the challenges offered by this new multilateralism to the liberal international order, such as by John Eikenberry, highlighted the role of non-state power brokers, Paula Subachi's work, and reflects on the possibilities of South-South cooperation. And of course, we have Emma Maudsley in the room. While appreciating the emergence of a new multilateralism, scholars are only just beginning to document the variations within the new Southern-led multilateralism. And this paper analyzes two different modes of Southern multilateralism by comparing the New Development Bank, the NDB, and the India-Brazil-South Africa Fund, the IBSA Fund. Staging a conversation between the constructivist approaches in IR with more recent formulations of power and hegemony, and here I'm thinking of Amitav Acharya's work, the paper hopes to document a slice of the diversity in Southern multilateralism and its implications on the liberal international order. I'm hoping that down the line, a major contribution of the paper would be to offer evidence of the variations within Southern multilateralism, and a subsidiary contribution would be to reflect on the lessons that can be exchanged between the New Development Bank and the IBSA Fund and with other established multilateral bodies to promote inclusive, sustainable development. But that, of course, is much further down the line. Now, several scholars have noted that global governance as it exists today is, and the terms that have been used are gridlocked, unraveling, and unfit for purpose. Processes that they say make a new multilateralism imperative. The pandemic exacerbated the growing crisis in the global order, but let us remember that this crisis has been long in the making. A variety of analysis, especially among IR scholars, suggests that we are entering a multipolar world, a post-liberal order, an interregnum between the collapse of the old, but where the emergence of the new has yet to sort of take shape. Against these arguments, you also see competing claims that suggest the dominance of the global north remains unchallenged, and that the liberal international order underpinning global governance is resilient enough to not only accommodate, but also socialize the rising powers. And that term is Eikenberry's. Departing from both these formulations, this grand challenge as well as accommodation, scholars have directed attention to more nuanced formulations that recognize the hybrid, pluralist, and mixed orders that are emerging from recent global changes. And here Amitav Acharya, for instance, writes about a multiplex global order in which different orders coexist rather than one destroying the other or accommodating or, subsuming the other. Within this multiplex global order, we can discern emerging contours of Southern multilateralism, or multilateralism innovated in and led by countries in the global South. And what I'm hoping to do in this paper, once it's written, completed rather, is to outline the characteristics of this emerging Southern multilateralism and direct attention to variations. Now, what might we mean by Southern multilateralism? Multilateralism is, quite simply put, an institutional arrangement between three or more countries aimed at solving collective problems. These problems could be of mutual relevance, limited to the countries involved, or they could be of more general relevance, extending beyond the countries involved. The UN, of course, is perhaps the best example of a multilateral arrangement that includes all countries of the world, at least theoretically. The World Trade Organization is another. In both these cases, you have countries that enter into institutional arrangements to work together to resolve mutual or general problems. Southern multilateralism refers to such institutional arrangements led by countries in the global South. The initiative for these arrangements comes from the Global South. Much of the resources are provided by countries of the Global South. And these arrangements could mean money, of course, but also involve technical know-how and exchange of ideas. Now, of course, and this audience will know that countries in the Global South have banded together at the UN and beyond in the past to advance their own views. You had the non-aligned movement in the 1960s that urged for the decolonization of the world and called for the spirit of racial, national, and economic equality to be respected. In the 1970s, you had a group of 77 countries working together, unsuccessfully as it turns out, at the United Nations to push for what they call the new international economic order. You've had a rich history of what has been called South-South cooperation that started with newly independent countries supporting one another during their anti-colonial struggle. And Emma's work, of course, outlines the three stages or three kinds of South-South cooperation. But these were bilateral arrangements between movements or countries rather than institutional arrangements. You had countries working together in blocks within the UN or the WTO. India and Brazil famously breached what was called the WTO Quad when they worked together to prevent the US and the EU from imposing free market principles on developing countries while heavily subsidizing their own farmers. So you have a history of alliances, cooperations, and banding together among Global South countries. Building on such alignments, but also differing from them, Southern multilateralism refers to formalized institutional arrangements between states of the Global South. How is it different from the multilateralism of the UN, one might ask? So the UN, or for that matter, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, they all have open membership. North or South, countries are free to join them as long as they can meet their basic obligations and fulfill specific criteria. But the impetus for the formation of the UN, and indeed most of what are called global institutions, comes from the global North. The UN is the product of the Atlantic Charter, the compact signed between Roosevelt and Churchill towards the end of the Second World War. While all countries can participate freely, we know that countries in the global North have successfully outmaneuvered the global South whenever the latter have raised difficult questions. The tussles over the new international economic order, which I mentioned earlier, are a case in point. So Southern multilateralism is about the global South initiating multilateral arrangements that prioritize and benefit Southern interests and ideas, which is not something the existing multilateral frameworks are seen to be doing on their own. I don't think of Southern multilateralism as replacing existing multilateralism. Rather, one could think of it as complementing or strengthening global multilateralism. And I think here lies a response to the question about whether Southern multilateralism challenges or tries to sort of pull down or bring down the liberal international order. In the remainder of this paper, which is, I think, another 6 or 7 minutes, Lydia, is that right? I want to direct our focus to these two examples of Southern multilateralism, both to explain the term as well as to illustrate variations within it. One is, as I've mentioned, the New Development Bank, the NDB. The second is the India, Brazil, South Africa Fund, or the IBSA Fund. The reason for focusing on the NDB stems from the backing it receives from the BRICS economies, whose recent economic growth has been widely applauded and who are often seen as providing an alternative to established multilateral organizations. The contrast with the IBSA Fund, which is a trilateral arrangement between India, Brazil, and South Africa, could not be starker. The absence of China and Russia, by design in the latter, has contributed to it being far lesser in profile. Their financial outlays are much smaller, and the nestedness of the IBSA Fund within the UN South-South cooperation has meant that they are seen as less of a threat to the prevailing global order. And I just want to say a bit about draw out this contrast a bit more in the next couple of minutes. The New Development Bank was established in 2014 at the 6th BRICS Summit held in Fortaleza in Brazil. It is headquartered in Shanghai, and its president and other key functionaries are drawn from the other founding countries. The bank had an initial subscribed capital of some $50 billion. And this initial capital is to be distributed among the founding members equally. The payment of the amount has to be paid in capital stock of the bank, will be made in 6 or 7 installments, and each member cannot increase its share of capital without the others agreeing. The bank does allow other new members to join, but BRICS capital share cannot be less than 55%. All members have an equal vote. The IPSA fund is a much older fund. It was established in 2004 and became operational in 2006. And it supports projects on a demand-driven basis through partnerships with local governments, national institutions, and other implementing partners. And a lot of their initiatives have stemmed from, ranged from promoting food security to address HIV/AIDS and extending access to safe drinking water. Remember, the NDB's initial outlay is $50 billion. The IPSA fund, by contrast, their outlay is $35 million. So it's tiny compared to the New Development Bank. But there are important differences in the way the two have operated beyond just the question of scale. In terms of identifying development challenges, the New Development Bank identifies infrastructure and sustainable development in the BRICS and other emerging economies and developing countries as key challenges that it wants to address. The IPSA fund, by contrast, focus on such issues as poverty, hunger, and social development. In terms of their strategies to address development challenges, the New Development Bank, extends loans to undertake infrastructure projects and sustainable development. It's a bank, after all, so loans are the key sort of modality for it. The IPSA fund, by contrast, offers small grants, which it works with partner countries to disperse. Their approaches to democracy, human rights, and social inclusion, as you can imagine, are quite different. It's not that the New Development Bank is against democracy or keeps quiet about democracy. It does talk a great deal about democracy, but does so in relation to what it calls internal democracy or organizational democracy. Its website makes a great deal about how it's a very democratic organization internally and how much it values diversity. By contrast, the IPSA fund very specifically and explicitly reflects on democracy and development as a global public good. The IPSA fund talks about democracy being integral to global development. And so in terms of constructing collective self-identities, you can see, of course, there are key similarities between the New Development Fund and the IPSA fund. They both identify themselves as actors emerging from the global South, but they also see themselves in very different terms. Not necessarily antagonistic to one another or in conflict with one another, but certainly emphasizing different elements of development and politics. In the paper, I'm hoping to also then reflect on the sorts of challenges that the two institutions are perceived to be having vis-a-vis the liberal international order. It is tempting to think that the NDB may be much more of a challenge to the liberal international order because of the involvement of China and Russia, because of it just being having such a huge outlay. By contrast, we may be tempted to think of the IPSA fund being much less of a challenge because it is, after all, tiny in terms of the funds it controls, and it does have, explicitly have a commitment towards democracy. And I think the way the paper will sort of tackle that is to urge us away from these binaries and think about how both the NDB and the IPSA fund may not necessarily, be setting out to challenge anything, and not least the liberal international order, But perhaps the NDB may well be more supportive of the economic aspects of the liberal international order, where you urge for global infrastructure development, global connectivity, and seamless sort of open borders, if you will. Not that borders will be irrelevant, but then you have infrastructure which crosses national borders. And the IPSA fund may well be supportive of the political aspects. Thank you, Lydia. I'm almost done. And the IPSA fund may be supportive of its political aspects, that is, make a great deal of noise about democracy and human rights, without, it is important to say, necessarily following those practices within their own countries. And I think the recent trajectories of both India and Brazil, and to an extent South Africa, also suggest how all three countries would sort of show themselves and project themselves as flag bearers of democracy without necessarily respecting those principles or practices within their own national borders. So in sum, I think the way the paper is going to sort of conclude, and you can see I'm still sort of working this through, is to reflect on how both the New Development Bank and the IPSA fund offer alternatives to existing global north supported ways of doing development. But they both contribute to the making of a multiplex global order. They don't necessarily challenge the liberal international order. They don't intend to challenge it, and they may not necessarily have the result of challenging it. But they do contribute to the making of what Amitav Acharya has called a multiplex global order, where different orders coexist with each other rather than one bringing the other down. That's where I'm at. So as I said, this is preliminary work. I welcome any comments, suggestions, areas that are obvious, but I've missed out for your consideration. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Indrajit. Really interesting presentation, really nice comparison between these two initiatives. And I really enjoyed also the fact that you've looked at historical trajectory of how different multiplayer alliances have either challenged from within or from outside existing international organizations and institutions. A few questions there on whether the existing order is liberal at all in my head, and some more, but let's open up. We have about 10 minutes for discussion. So you can either write your question or comment in the chat, or just raise your hand. I should be able to see it here. Anyone wishing to start? We have Alex. Let's take a couple, perhaps. Let's take 2 or 3. Have Alex there. Who else would like to follow? Well, let's go with Alex and then Rory. Please, Alex, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Lydia, and thanks a lot, Indra. I really liked the sweep of this and the ambition. I think this is an exciting topic. But I did want to pick up, and I think it's, Lydia's already flagged this question about to what extent are we talking about a liberal order. And I think I was wondering if what your view would be on how helpful it would be to approach this as a question of placing more emphasis on national sovereignty versus more emphasis on multilateralism according to the behavior of key countries in the global north. And so obviously we've seen, if you like, unruly unilateralist behavior. I mean, most dramatically during the Trump presidency, but actually going back to, the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003 and so on. So as we have a history of violations of the multilateral letter and spirit by UN Security Council member countries from the global north, and a move, certainly at the time when I was watching this more closely in Brazil, definitely a view that reinforcing the UN was a countermeasure to that. So I guess the question there is, when it is the traditionally dominant actors of the global north that are making the liberal order illiberal, to what extent does that produce a countervailing movement of key countries in the global south, such as India, Brazil, and China is a very interesting case in regard to this, in relation to its attitude towards multilateralism. To what extent is it a kind of seesaw rather than a trajectory? I guess would be my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Let's take also Rory's question and then ask Indrajit to react.
Andrew, thanks. Great presentation. My question is really, what extent is the phenomenon, or do you see the phenomenon of Southern multilateralism, particularly beyond these two examples you've provided? So, I mean, by your definition, presumably regional, continental institutions would count as Southern multilateralism. So is the distinctive thing you're trying to get at here kind of cross, I don't know what you call it, but inter-regional or cross-continental Southern multilateralism? And are there, to what extent are there other examples, and is this a wider phenomenon if we take it in that regard? Thank you.
Let's just take another one from Laura and then pass to you, Indrajit.
Thank you. Sorry for flagging a little bit late. I was just wondering because, it's a fascinating topic and we have been asking the same questions here. I was just wondering, how are you conceiving, in order to assess whether, it's contributing or undermining the liberal order, are you talking about the structure? So the ways in which those institutions are being structured, designed, the rules, the rules of the game, or are you talking about the outcomes? So how, in a way, what are those IBSA fund poverty alleviation projects are contributing or undermining certain, values, norms, and so, for instance, just to flag something, because if you consider, for instance, citizen participation and the ways in which participation was or not embedded in those two Southern multilateral institutions you were mentioning, although the discourse is very much about, democracy in IBSA fund, and it is about democratic voting system and voting rights in NDB, they are very anti-participation. And, the kind of work I've been doing, it's really to flag that this kind of, in a way, this kind of a disjunction, if you want to put it. So just to kind of raise this conversation about how do we assess whether it's contributing or undermining?
Great. 3 great comments, challenging questions for you, Indrajit. Go ahead.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. These are exactly the sorts of questions I need at this stage, while I'm still thinking these things through. I think in terms of the comment about, to what extent is the liberal international order really liberal, and to what, the fact that it is dominated, of course, by the global north. Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's a question of taking it's a question of taking their collective self-identity at face value. It's a question of taking at face value all that is said about the liberal international order being open, rules-based, etc., whereas in fact it may not be, as you've showed. But I think at the end of the day, there is something to be said about how the global north has managed to perpetuate the idea that what they've set in motion is in fact one based on free trade and democracy, whereas of course that's not the case. Ultimately, though, the so-called liberal international order was the product of the victors of the Second World War coming together, a compact, as I said, between Roosevelt and Churchill, and there's no running away from that. It is true that a number of the global South countries did play a seminal role in the expansion of the United Nations, in ensuring that a lot of the covenants were put in place. But at the end of the day, the UN emerged as a result of the compromises between the victors of the Second World War. And this, of course, those of us who have worked towards or who are looking at decolonizing, the history of global institutions, have urged us to consider the role of global South actors. But as I said, the origin story is something we cannot forget. And I think that's the reason that for so long, the UN has remained, in a sense, despite the very important points you raised, Alex, about how there is an attempt to rein in the UN and to think of the UN as, something that comes in the way. But the point is that the global North has consistently outmaneuvered the global South in most UN sort of forums. They've been able to do things despite a large number of UN members opposing them. And of course, when it came to such substantive demands as we saw in the new international economic order of the 1970s, there was just no way the overwhelming majority of the global South could do anything. Now, that does not necessarily mean that, and this, I suppose, brings to the question that Rory asked in terms of, what are the alternatives? And you have regional development alternatives, of course. But when I was thinking of Southern multilateralism, I haven't, to be honest, given enough thought as to whether regional development or regional institutions are the best examples of Southern multilateralism. I have been thinking about these cross-continental arrangements as examples of Southern multilateralism. In terms of more examples, I have to think of it, I guess, a little more myself. I don't know whether Eurasian banks will be considered, southern enough, because they, obviously sort of look over at least two continents. But no, I have to give more thought to it. It would be tempting to say that regional institutions are examples of Southern multilateralism, but I think that might be a cop-out. So I don't have an answer to your question, Rory, yet, except to say that it's something I'm still thinking about. And I think Laura's question nicely ties up with the point that was initially made, by you, Alex, in terms of the BRICS nations, including the Indias and the Brazils, are hardly the sort of, best examples of democracy anymore. And yet they make a great deal of noise about democracy. And so whether I'm thinking about, the outcomes of these institutions in terms of their structures or in terms of whether I'm thinking about the democratizing element of these institutions in terms of their structures or in terms of their outcomes, I'm really thinking about, again, at this very preliminary stage, the collective self-identity. How do these countries and how do these institutions project themselves? I'm not thinking of these so much as rhetoric. I don't think it's rhetoric. I think there is something to be said about how institutions project themselves. And I'm not going to go the post-structuralist route to be doing discourse analysis necessarily, but I do think that there is a way of thinking about how institutions and agencies and multilateral organizations think about themselves and project themselves without necessarily invoking Lacan. So I do think I'm only looking at how they've projected themselves, what sorts of projects they've funded, without necessarily looking at the outcomes of those projects. So again, that's a limited response, Laura, but I think at this stage, that's the best I'm able to do. That's
great, Indrajit, and thank you very much for really, really interesting bit of the session. I know that you have to leave and join another session. Actually, before you go, I just wanted to make a brief comment in relation to what you said, that these Southern multilateralism are not challenging the existing order. You might want to engage with an argument. I think it's in a paper by Philip McMichael. He's a food politics scholar, and he's talked about China pursuing a very controversial argument, pursuing the short game and the long game. The short game really fitting in the existing order in terms of the way it does trade and investment and all of that, and the long game that in the long term is trying to transform that order from within. So I think that might be something you want to engage with. But I hope we see you in tomorrow's sessions, because I think there'll be a lot of interest to your analysis, and I think you can make also contribution to those sessions. But let us now move on to the next paper by Dr. Pippa Morgan, lecturer of political science at Duke Kersham University, and she's joining us from China. It's late in the day there. Thank you very much for staying up for us. So she's presenting a paper on the political economy of bilateral lending from emerging donors, comparing lending from the BRICS donors with the traditional Paris Club. And this is, of course, has always been a hot topic in relation to China, particularly, right? The extent to which China was undermining efforts to presumably pursue efforts to contain levels of indebtedness that were unsustainable. So I think Pippa's paper is going to answer some questions for us. Go ahead, Pippa, you have 18 minutes as well.
Great, thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you to both Lydia and Rory for organizing this session. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me a moment. All right, can everybody see my screen now?
We can see a slide.
Sorry.
Potential method.
I need to scroll back to
the start.
Perfect.
Yes. Perfect. Now, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this paper. So this is a paper that I'm working on for a journal special issue on sovereign debt, which is actually due quite soon. So I'm very much looking forward to feedback and comments and questions. So this is on, as Lydia mentioned, the political economy of bilateral lending from emerging donors, or I changed the title slightly to emerging creditors. And I don't need to kind of start with this audience by explaining that, there's increasing global attention on emerging economies as sources of bilateral official finance. And so by that, I mean country to country, government affiliated organization to government affiliated organization. And focusing here on loans rather than grants. And in particular, there's attention on the BRICS, China, by that I mean China, Russia, India, and Brazil, not the kind of conventional BRICS grouping, which includes South Africa. South Africa does not actually provide bilateral official finance. However, these emerging bilateral creditors, so China, Russia, India, and Brazil, that's in order of their kind of size of provision of bilateral official loans, have not released detailed or consistent kind of official data on their overseas lending activities in the way that, for example, the OECD Development Assistance Committee do. And there have arisen kind of several efforts or attempts to fill this data gap in quantitative information on the lending activities of these countries, in particular relating to China, as I expect that some or all of you will be familiar with, for example, the efforts of aid data to collect information on Chinese official finance, so loans, grants, and other types of financial flows. Also, of course, the Johns Hopkins SAIS CARI, who collect data on Chinese lending in Africa specifically. However, most of these efforts focus on China. And because it collects this information and kind of using different definitions according to different methodologies and in different ways, it makes kind of systematic comparison across emerging lenders very difficult. So it's hard to, it has been thus far, very hard to quantitatively compare the lending activities of China, Russia, India, and Brazil with each other and also with the traditional creditors. However, happily, in the autumn of last year, the World Bank actually released publicly some new information that makes this much easier. So the World Bank's debtor reporting system, for the first time, released data disaggregated by creditor country. So what that means is we can see who owes what to whom for each country that borrows from the World Bank, and so reports this information of what they owe in terms of their external debt to the World Bank. So they released this information last year alongside the 2021 international debt statistics. And this basically creates an opportunity, a new opportunity for systematic quantitative comparison. And so just to say a little bit about the DRS data. So in terms of what's very useful about it, it covers a lot of countries. So all 120 countries reporting to this information to the World Bank. It is generally compiled according to a standardized set of methods, and it's coded consistently. So it allows us to do panel data analysis across these countries over this period 2000-2019. It does have some limitations. So the World Bank acknowledges that it's borrower reported, different borrowers have different abilities to actually collect and provide this information. There are also, in particular, in the case of China, concerns have been raised about creditor-imposed confidentiality agreements risking under-reporting. So essentially, China asking or instructing, contractually obliging certain borrowers not to publicly report the information about the loans that they've taken from China. So there could be some under-reporting here. But despite that, this is the best data for comparative analysis across China, Russia, India, and Brazil, and really presents an opportunity to compare them both with each other and also with the traditional OECD creditors. And so just to highlight a few kind of descriptive things from what we see from the World Bank's DRS data. So again, this is just a chance to kind of use this systematic data to check some of our existing, assumptions and beliefs and claims about the lending from the BRICS countries. And so these two charts basically just chart over time, first of all, the BRICS as a group, so adding together all of their official lending and comparing that both with the OECD creditors and with the World Bank. And so you can see that this blue line here, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China have really risen from a very negligible level in 2000 to rivaling the World Bank in several years and being substantially higher than the OECD countries as a group. The second chart here disaggregates Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and also just adds in the USA, which is, of course, the world's largest economy, and Japan, which is the largest OECD provider of bilateral loans. And so you can see here that China, as you would expect, so just confirming what we already think, China is the world's largest official bilateral creditor. China is this yellow line here. But you can also see that the other BRICS are not insubstantial. In particular, Russia is rivaling Japan in certain years. And actually, it's kind of remarkable how little attention there is on Russian lending, given its significance. India and Brazil are, of course, smaller, but still, compared to, for example, the USA as a provider of bilateral loans, not insignificant. And for those countries that they do lend to it, they're important. So these maps just chart the variation across space. And so again, these really don't kind of give any surprises, just are an opportunity to check what we kind of already thought or assumed using this new World Bank data. So China is the first one here, and India is underneath China. And you can see that China and India are, while they lend a lot in their neighborhood, China is also very geographically dispersed. So Chinese lending in Africa is very significant, and also in Latin America. India also lends a lot to some of its neighbors, but also is reasonably active within Africa, but not at all in Latin America. And then turning here to Russia and Brazil, so we can really see that Brazilian lending is concentrated in Latin America, and also to some extent in the African Lusophone states. And then Russia also concentrated in a small number of countries, although not necessarily within Russia's kind of geography. Okay, so those are some descriptive charts, and I also use this data to statistically analyze the correlations between some of the political or economic factors that may motivate bilateral lending from the BRICS. So again, this is just an opportunity to kind of check some existing hypotheses or claims about why the BRICS countries lend to other developing states, and to compare them with each other and to traditional creditors. So I have three hypotheses, basically drawn from existing literature, either on the individual BRICS, on bilateral lending more widely, or studies of finance from emerging creditors. So the first one relates to economics. These are pretty simple hypotheses, by the way. It's just an opportunity to kind of use this data to systematically check them. And so the first one is that the BRICS are motivated by economics, right? So they want to use their bilateral official lending to create opportunities for their own companies, to create trading opportunities. And so this hypothesis is that the BRICS provide more bilateral finance to countries they trade with more, all other things being equal. Hypothesis 2 relates to politics, relates to foreign policy. So it's commonly claimed that the BRICS, and in particular China, are using bilateral lending as a foreign policy tool. So as a tool to persuade other countries to take their line in terms of international political issues, and so on and so forth. So I use here a common measure of foreign policy alignment within the quantitative literature on foreign aid and international political economy more broadly, which is UN voting ideal point, which is basically a measure of the distance between the voting behavior of countries within the United Nations. And so the hypothesis here is that BRICS will provide basically fewer loans to countries that have greater foreign policy distance from them. So for example, China would provide less bilateral official finance to a country that tends to vote less in the way that China does in the United Nations, for example. And hypothesis 3 relates to geography. So there are some existing papers that suggest that emerging creditors tend to lend more to their neighbors. And so again, this data present an opportunity to kind of to check that and to see whether that finding is supported using this new data from the World Bank. I'm not going to go into methodological details in the interest of time, so I just skip over this, but just suffice to say that I statistically analyze I statistically test these three hypotheses, controlling for various other things that might affect bilateral lending behavior. So on to the findings. So in line with expectations, the BRICS lend proportionally more to their trading partners. So there's a positive and statistically significant relationship between bilateral official loans from the BRICS countries and trade with borrowers. However, contrary to expectations, foreign policy distance is insignificant. So essentially, it suggests that foreign policy is not an important consideration in BRICS bilateral lending. And I also checked a number of other measures of foreign policy alignment, such as, for example, whether the borrower is a member of the UN Security Council, which could make them kind of more, politically salient and incentivize lending from the BRICS, and military alliances between the borrower and lender, and also found these to be insignificant. So they seem to not matter, essentially. I found that the BRICS as a group seem to lend significantly more to geographically contiguous countries, so their neighbors, although for China and Russia, those results are statistically insignificant. So what this suggests, broadly speaking, is that BRICS lending is driven by economics, not by geopolitics. So Brazil, Russia, India, and China seem to be, according to these findings, using their bilateral loans to, for example, build trading opportunities for their own countries, but they don't seem to be using this, at least according to the statistical analysis, as a foreign policy tool. So this is just a visual illustration of the findings. So you can see here that the stars indicate statistical significance. So you can see here that for most of the BRICS, except for Russia, trade is significantly correlated with bilateral official finance. UN voting distance does not seem to matter. And geographical contiguity is important, in particular for Brazil, but seems to be insignificant for China and for Russia. So this data also presents an opportunity to test whether or not, or to compare the terms that are offered by the BRICS and the traditional OECD creditors, because it's very commonly claimed and assumed that BRICS loans are offered on less concessional terms than traditional lenders. And while these data don't actually report directly the terms on a given loan from, say, India to Nepal, for example, what they do is countries report their overall terms that they face on their external debt. So by putting that together with information on how much the DRS countries borrow from particular lenders, you can see whether or not countries that tend to borrow more from the BRICS relative to the traditional lenders tend to face kind of harsher or less concessional terms. So I have three sub-hypotheses here. Countries that borrow more from the BRICS will face higher interest rates on their official external debts. They will also face relatively shorter grace periods on their official external debts. They will also face, I hypothesize, relatively lower grant elements in their official external debts. Again, we'll not go into methodological details. Suffice to say that I test the hypotheses statistically. I'm happy to talk about methodology in the Q&A, by the way. 2 minutes. Okay, I'm almost at the end. Okay, so very quickly, the findings on terms confirm the expectation. So countries that borrow proportionally more from the BRICS have higher interest rates, shorter grace periods, and lower grant elements. So compared to traditional official creditors, so the OECD countries, it seems that the BRICS, as expected, offer less concessional terms. So just a visualization of one of those findings. So these are the coefficients for interest rates. So you can see that for most of the BRICS, statistically significantly higher interest rates. Okay, so what are the implications of this? Very quickly, I think it's a mixed bag. So at least according to this data, according to the World Bank DRS data, and the statistical analysis of it, it seems like concerns about the BRICS using bilateral official lending, and I stress here I'm talking specifically about bilateral official lending, not other types of development assistance more broadly defined, but there does not seem to be a correlation between bilateral official loans and geopolitics, so UN voting behavior, military alliances, and so on and so forth. Instead, BRICS lending is associated with economic factors, so with trading ties, with trade overall, and I also checked with imports and exports separately, and also for Brazil and India with geographical contiguity. Another thing that I actually should have mentioned previously in the presentation, apologies, I realized that I skipped over that part, but I also found that there's a positive correlation between the BRICS and the OECD creditors. So they actually seem to be complementary to each other rather than kind of substituting for each other. However, compared to the OECD creditors, the results of this analysis at least suggest that and confirm expectations and claims that the BRICS finance is offered on less concessional terms than that from traditional creditors. Okay, and that's everything from me. Looking forward to your questions and your comments.
Thanks very much, Pippa. Thank you. Another very interesting presentation. Great to see those hypotheses tested there. You know, I think many of us have often used some of these hypotheses without probably having enough supporting material, but just drawing on secondary data. So it's great that you have done this rigorously. I was wondering, I'm glad that at the end you've started noting how some of your findings relate to particular countries. I was going to ask you how much of this is shaped by China, right? I presume China is the dominant player in the data. So I wonder whether the story is shaped by that. But I think your findings are very consistent with what Chinese scholars themselves have identified as China's pragmatic approach, which is primarily driven by economic interests rather than geopolitics, especially when thinking about financial lending and cooperation relations in faraway countries. But let's open up for questions, and we have Emma Mosley with her hand raised. Let me just go back to the gallery mode so that I can see you all. So Emma, who else would like to join the queue? Let's go ahead, Emma, whilst the others are thinking.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to see so many friends and colleagues. So Pippa, I'm really sorry if I've missed this, and it's not my area of strength at all. I was just wondering about did your analysis include, was it really like for like? I mean, if there's one thing about the sort of those loans, what we think of them very often, the general view is that they're more concessional. And I was just wondering what I think you're saying that you weren't including ODA, but what bilateral official lending has a grant element? Because that would automatically make the BRICS loans, which don't tend to have much, grant element, more expensive. Do you see what I mean? I just wonder how confident you feel that it's like for like, because so often those comparisons are poorly drawn. I do have another question, but I'll wait. Thank you.
And we have Alex Shanklin. Alex, go ahead.
Thanks, Pippa. Yeah, definitely not my area. I learned a lot and look forward to reading the full paper and learning a lot more. But I was thinking, actually provoked by your observation that South Africa doesn't do development finance lending, whereas of course DBSA is a big lender. And then I realized that it may be because DBSA lends to South African companies to invest in other African nations, in which case that raises a whole issue of categorization of investment, which would apply to Brazil's BNDES lending for investments in Angola and Mozambique. It would apply to a lot of Indian finance. It would certainly apply to a lot of Chinese financing of SOEs and so on. So I was wondering how different your findings would be if they didn't apply only to sovereign lending, which I'm understanding they do, right? This is government to government sovereign loans. Do you have any data sources? Have you explored at all? Is it technically possible to look at how different this is when you factor in loans to lender nation companies? Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Pippa, would you like to go ahead and address those two questions?
Absolutely. So thank you so much to Emma and Alex for the questions. Those are really great questions. And I also respond to the comment from the great comment from Lydia about, to what extent is this driven by China, given the size of China within this. So I think, yes, to a large extent, the aggregate patterns are driven by China, given its scale. If you look at India, I also disaggregated for each of the BRICS. And if you look at India and Brazil, broadly speaking, the patterns for China they're fairly similar to China. Whereas Russia seems quite different and to some extent a little bit more similar to the traditional creditors. So I would actually like to do a little bit more work on the Russian case. I'm by no means an expert on Russia. So that's food for thought for the future. In response to the question from Emma on to what extent is this like for like, to what extent is there a grant element within, or how can there be a grant element within BRICS lending? So essentially what the World Bank data reports is each of the DRS countries will report their new bilateral official loan commitments from each creditor. And you can't actually see within the data whether or not those new commitments are concessional or non-concessional. And of course, we know, for example, in the Chinese case, and also true for others, that certainly in the Chinese case, most of the Chinese loans are non-concessional, but there are some concessional loans. In terms of what I look at in the first part of the analysis, in terms of motivations, that doesn't really go into, for example, are concessional loans more associated with, might be more associated with, for example, political factors. The data don't really allow me to do that. Because you can't see whether or not, say, a given commitment in a given year from a given country to another country is concessional or non-concessional. However, what you can do is look at, within this data, each of the DRS countries will report their kind of overall terms that they face on their external debts. So what I did is basically look at proportionally which countries tend to borrow more from the BRICS and which countries tend to borrow more from the OECD creditors, and then see, do the OECD creditors do the people that tend to borrow, or countries that tend to borrow more from the OECD creditors, face kind of softer terms, and that is what I found. So to be honest, I don't think that is a kind of super exciting pattern, right? It's exactly what you'd expect. But these data just provide us, a kind of systematic way to confirm that. Okay, and on the question from Alex on the South Africa case, also a great question. And so basically the DRS countries report official loans and private loans. And so in this paper, I just focus on the official ones, basically for reasons of scope, because otherwise papers grow and grow forever. And, that could be, I think it's a fantastic idea for another paper. And so basically the reason I didn't include South Africa is because when you look at the data, there's no bilateral official South African finance or bilateral official South African lending. And to be honest, this actually speaks to a potential limitation with this data, in that it's not really possible for me to see, why has someone decided that DBSA doesn't count as official, right? So it's very much a limitation of the data and the study more broadly. However, broadly speaking, on the, how different would the findings be if they didn't apply to sovereign lending, but also included private lending? I think this is absolutely a fascinating question. And, me or someone else could write another paper on this using the World Bank data, but basically for reasons of length and scope, I don't look at that here.
Thanks, Pippa. And just very quickly, we're running out of time, but there's a question in the chat on Russia. The map seemed to show that a lot of Russia's lending went to India. Any explanation about that pattern? And there's also a suggestion by Emma of a paper that discusses the challenges of calculating India's finance that you might want to look at. So do you want to quickly reply to Ishian?
Yes, I will. Okay, so that's a wonderful question. My response will be very quick in that I don't currently have any explanation about that pattern. So one of the things I mentioned is that I actually think there's scope for a lot more work on Russia. Russian bilateral official lending, actually pretty big, and not very many people seem to be talking about it. So that's something that I would really like to look at in more detail, but I don't have an explanation for that at the moment. Very good observation, though. And also thank you so much to Emma for the suggestion of the paper on Indian Exim finance. I will definitely read and cite that in my paper. So very useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pippa. And we should now move on to the next paper, but another really, really exciting piece of work, and we look forward to reading your paper. So the third and final paper of this first session is on trilateral cooperation, another favorite for those of us following the rising powers topic. And this paper is on power, politics, and the geoeconomics of trilateral development cooperation. Dr. Cynthia Camuengo, postdoctoral research associate at the University of Bath. Cynthia, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Lydia. It's always a little hard to come at the end after some really great presentations, but hopefully I'll keep you interested. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to share that right now. There you go. There, okay. Yes, so today my presentation is drawn from a paper that I've just completed. So I'll also appreciate any feedback that you can give me on the presentation. It's titled Power Politics and the Geoeconomics of Trilateral Development Cooperation. I'm going to start with just a definition because I know not everyone is familiar with trilateral cooperation. I'm looking at a modality where you have the South-South exchange being supported by a partner from the global north. This can be a multilateral institution like the World Bank or UN agency, or a member of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. This modality is very interesting because in some cases, all the partners contribute finances, and this helps to encourage a sense of horizontality. TDC began in the 1990s, but it's really taken off in the last 15 years. And it's been, a lot of TDC projects have been initiated by Northern donors. And this is really in response to the rise of Southern development partners, such as China, India, and Brazil. And a lot of DAC donors realize that there's need to move from competing with Southern partners to collaborating with them. Now, a lot of studies on trilateral cooperation, they're very policy-oriented. They've been published by the OECD and UN agencies. There is some academic literature that has developed over the last few years, but a lot of it tends to focus on the policy concerns and the motives of development cooperation providers. So this is the gap that my research is trying to address. And I draw on Joanne Sharp's concept of the subaltern in geopolitics to argue that the marginalization of beneficiary partner voices and their perspective on this modality, and especially African countries, since they're the majority of least developed countries, this relegates them as a subaltern. It positions them at a lower rank in the hierarchy of global power and development. But we can only really understand some of the shifts that are happening when we center their voices and we theorize from their perspective. So my case study country was Zambia, and I looked at two projects. The first, Triangle of Hope Investment Promotion Project, was implemented between 2006 and 2012. And in this project, Japan helped to facilitate knowledge transfers from Malaysia to Zambia. There was a focus on policy and legislation that Malaysia was able to use to transform its post-colonial economy from one that depended on the export of primary commodities to one that had a large FDI-driven manufacturing sector. And economic diversification has been Zambia's long-term and primary goal since independence. So this is why this project took place. And then the second project that I looked at was the China-Zambia Renewable Energy Technology Transfer Project. This was implemented between 2014 and 2019. In this project, China facilitated the transfer of knowledge and technologies on solar energy and small hydropower to Zambia in order to provide off-grid solutions for rural electrification. So you can see from this image that I have here, this is a large hydropower dam, which is what Zambia has always relied on. But the amount of electricity that was generated was not able to cover the whole country. And so rural areas have always not had access to the national grid. So this project was aimed at addressing this issue. And Denmark provided financing for this project. And then the UNDP country offices in China and Zambia facilitated this whole exchange. Now, I tried to understand different aspects of these projects. I found that when I got different information depending on who I talked to. So when I talked to some of the people who were involved in the implementation of the project, there were academics who were involved, some scientists, and mid to senior. I'd say when I talked to junior civil servants, they all looked at the projects in terms of what I categorize as the institutional level. They were focused on delivering these projects effectively, and they were focused on, having effective and sustainable development outcomes. That's how they were looking at it. But when I talked to senior level civil servants and some policymakers, they were able to give me some insight into some of the foreign policy and commercial interests that were tied to these projects. And so I kind of argue that there's the institutional level that a lot of academics and development practitioners look at, and then there's the national and global scale of trilateral development cooperation, which a lot of politicians and policymakers and senior level bureaucrats, this is how they look at these projects. So what I found in Zambia, one of the issues that drove the government to actually agree to participate in these two projects, because lots of donors had proposed TDC projects, but most proposals never went to full implementation. And I found that the reason these two projects were implemented is because they aligned with the government's interests in learning from the policy experiences of East Asian countries. And this interest was really, I guess it was encouraged by Japan during the 2003 Tokyo International Conference on African Development. Japan proposed Asia-Africa technical cooperation as a model by which African countries could facilitate rapid economic development by learning from the challenges and successes of these countries. So then President of Zambia, Levi Mwanawasa, he had attended this TICAD, he was inspired, and he directed his cabinet ministers to try to initiate technical cooperation, obviously with Asian countries, but also trade and investments. And this is where these two projects, this is where actually the Triangle of Hope kind of came into play. And the Zambian government actually lobbied Japan to be considered as a beneficiary partner for the Triangle of Hope, because initially Japan was looking at some other countries. I found that this interest, it aligned with Japan's wider, I guess it's part of its foreign policy, but this is part of the issue of where knowledge is a form of power, and any country or institution that is perceived to be a source of development knowledge, they have a lot of power to influence the development trajectory of a beneficiary partner, and Japan recognizes that. And the actual policies and legislation that Japan was facilitating was helping Malaysia to transfer. These are some of the lessons that Malaysia adapted from Japan itself through technical cooperation it received from Japan in the 1980s. So Japan is doing this not only in Zambia, but in a lot of other African countries and Southeast Asian countries, facilitating transfer of lessons that it shared to some Asian beneficiary countries, its former beneficiary countries, now to other countries. And it has an interest in positioning its own model of economic development, but more generally East Asian models of economic development as preferred alternatives to the Western models that a lot of African countries have been trying to follow. And in Zambia, a lot of countries, I guess in Zambia, the government was really interested. There was this push in making the government realize that in 1964, when Zambia got independence, its GDP per capita was much higher than countries like Malaysia, even South Korea and Thailand. But within 20 years, those countries had, their socio-economic development had surpassed it. So it was kind of argued that then it's better to kind of follow East Asian models because there's a lot that can be learned from it compared to Western models. So I kind of argue that this is an Easternization of development thinking in Zambia. And a lot of Western donors. So actually I found this interesting that although Japan is often categorized as part of the global North, it has this interest in Easternizing development thinking. And then Western donors such as Denmark, they're interested in re-Westernizing development thinking. So one of Denmark's main aim in the renewable energy project with China was to convey its best practice and to convince partner countries, both China as a Southern development cooperation provider and even Zambia, that Western political, economic, and regulatory frameworks are the most appropriate ways for delivering and receiving development cooperation. So these projects were really connected to the foreign policy of each of the countries. These were mainly government-to-government exchanges. And I was able to really see how development cooperation is a political tool for these different countries. The Zambian stakeholders that I talked to, they told me that they felt that TDC is just a tool for for Northern donors to remain relevant in the global architecture. And I was actually surprised to find that by looking at policy documents, but even interviewing some of the representatives of the donor agencies from Denmark and Japan, they did agree that one of the things that was driving them, TDC was a really good tool to be able to maintain some soft power influence in the global development, in African countries, and then also to maintain a leadership role. And the representative of JICA, he actually told me that Japan's main interest with TDC is to project its image and to still show that it has a presence in Africa, given that China has risen to become, the leading Asian donor in Africa. So TDC helps Japan to still project that image that it's there. And then I found that Zambian, policy leads, they were very much aware of the fact that there are all these different interests playing out, and they were very focused on protecting their interests. So in the Triangle of Hope, Japan tried to push for Taiwan to be included on the countries that would be visited for investment promotion missions, but the Zambian government refused because this was around 2006, 2007, and the opposition political party leader at that time, he had been using an anti-Chinese investment kind of discourse in his election campaigns. And he had promised to recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state. So there was a lot of concern that there was a lot of tension with the Chinese government. So to protect their relationship with China, and especially at that time, they were trying to really lobby for increased Chinese investment. So they refused to include Taiwan in the Triangle of Hope. And then over the last 10 years, China has become Zambia's most important bilateral partner, especially because it doesn't require a lot of economic policy reforms. or good governance reforms compared to northern donors. So I found that when I was trying to research on the partnership with China in the renewable energy project, I got a lot of resistance, and they wanted to protect it. And a lot of the different people tried to really paint a positive image. But once they did get comfortable with me, they were able to admit that there were some power inequalities with their Chinese partners, and they felt the Chinese partners were trying to be a bit pushy, but they were also able to assert their voice. And they said the trilateral modality helped that because the financing was coming from Denmark. So it created some kind of balance. I found that China's interest in the renewable energy project and in TDC was really to learn about OECD best practice from Denmark. There's been, obviously, we all know, a lot of negative coverage of China's cooperation in Zambia and other African countries. So China just wants to learn. It's tired of all the Chinese colonialism and the Chinese threat in Africa. So it wants to prove the effectiveness of its development interventions and to be able to replicate it. I found that, and overall to reform its image from being a predator to being a responsible development actor. And I found, for example, it was able to institutionalize the lessons learned from the renewable energy project. It's created a SouthSouth Center for Technology Transfer that is replicating this model from the Zambia project and a parallel project that took place in Ghana. And now it's replicating it in Ethiopia and Sri Lanka. And then I also found that these projects facilitated policy reforms to increase private sector investment in the different sectors. And what it really did was create an opportunity for private sector actors in the donor countries to access commercial markets and investment opportunities in Zambia. And I put up this quote here that you can see where the Zambian stakeholders said they were very clear that they knew, for example, China was able to offload its surplus technologies from its renewable energy industry in Zambia. That was the aim of the project, their underlying interest in the project. And the Zambians were very aware of that. Even Denmark was able to create an opportunity for its Danish renewable energy industry. Malaysia was able to get investment opportunities in Zambia from the Triangle of Hope. So they said they were very aware of that. And they didn't care because they felt that development cooperation is not about charity. Each country knows their interest that they have in TDC. And the Zambian interest was really to build local skills and capacity in, for example, in renewable energy, the ability to conduct feasibility studies, to build energy infrastructure and maintain them so that the country could delink from its dependence on foreign consultants and become self-reliant, which is one of its long-standing goals, again, since Zambia's independence. And just to end off quickly, I feel that the COVID pandemic has enhanced the value of technical cooperation. So, and especially the fact that a lot of East Asian countries have done a much better job, I would say, in managing COVID. So a lot more countries will be looking to Asia for more lessons. But even countries such as Cuba have a lot of potential to become pivotal partners in trilateral cooperation. And then, of course, the budgetary pressure that it's created for even DAC donors. I predict a lot more DAC donors will be interested in engaging in trilateral development cooperation because they can maintain that status as a donor, but at a lower cost. My research showed that promoting national interest is a function of TDC, but beneficiary partners do not have a strategy. And so they do need to develop it so they can negotiate these projects to secure national interest, but also to ensure that they result in sustainable development outcomes, which is a problem Zambia had in these projects. And then for any project to move from proposal stage to full implementation, it has to align with the development plans of the beneficiary partner. And this is what the donors have to take into account if they want to propose these projects and make sure they succeed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cynthia. Right on time. You may want to stop sharing your screen. Yeah, so thanks a lot. Really interesting presentation on trilateral development cooperation is a topic that I know that several of our participants here today have been looking into and discussing, long discussions on what trilateral cooperation means, right? And you tell the story of how different players use it and see it to pursue their own interests. You talked about the different agencies, recipient or provider agencies involved in these two projects. You didn't say much about the UNDP, and that's the UN, of course, has its own agenda on TDC. So I wonder, when we come to the when I give you a chance to address the questions that will soon emerge, you can also comment on the UN UNEP role, particularly in this TDC modality. But I was also wondering whether you could reflect on whether this modality is actually seen as a trilateral cooperation modality from the recipient side. You talked about the Zambian government officials talking about their interest in learning from East Asian models, right? So, do they actually recognize that there are two distinct partners involved? Do they see the trilateral element of the modality, or is that not relevant at all? It's just another project which turns out to be funded by a particular set of donors. So I wonder whether you could reflect on, the trilateral aspect of cooperation and whether that is at all visible on the recipient side. But let's just park those questions there for a moment and see who else would like to join in with a comment or a question. Alex, thank you. Go ahead, please.
I was waiting because it's always me asking the questions. I'm waiting for someone else. But I really did like that presentation. It's great to see how your work's evolved as well since the last time I heard you present. And this is really exciting, interesting work. But I wanted to ask you. So Lydia alluded to the desire to learn, and I think that's kind of a recurrent theme, right? So you spoke about, if you like, two sides of the triangle wanting to learn. Right. So potentially China wanted to learn from an OECD donor about good donorship or whatever, or how to avoid, becoming a political football in a southern country. And arguably, and then Zambia wanted to learn from East Asian models. I didn't hear a lot about what Japan or Denmark, or indeed UNDP, as they decided, might have wanted to learn. And I was wondering what reflections you might have about the potential asymmetry of learning, given that knowledge is power, as you say, and that so much of these are knowledge-led projects. They're projects whose rationale is very much about know-how. Do you see moves towards a more symmetrical approach to mutual learning, where China and Japan and Denmark are learning from Zambia, and there's more of a flow, and perhaps there's more interest from OECD donors, from learning from South-South cooperation partners. Do you see any emergence of that from the projects you've studied, or are we still talking about a basically asymmetrical learning triangle, if you like?
Yeah. Okay, I think I can answer his question and yours, Lydia, a little bit. So I think in terms of UNDP, what I found to be its interests, and I guess even Japan and Denmark, is really just to be positioned as a facilitator. So obviously, traditionally, being seen as a source of development knowledge gave a form of power. But then these different, agencies have also trying to position themselves as the facilitators and get some form of power and influence from that position. So I was told, for example, for Denmark, one of the issues they had is that developing relations with the Chinese government and getting access to Chinese government officials is really difficult. So the one comment I was constantly told is Denmark's only interest is China in this project. So when it came to the implementation stage, there was no Danish presence in Zambia. So that was one thing. They wanted to build some relations with China through this project. But Japan, more generally, it's really just to position itself as a facilitator of moving, knowledge from East Asia to Africa, to Zambia. I would say in terms of mutual learning, there's a lot of talk of trilateral development cooperation promoting mutual learning, but I found that wasn't the case. Of course, a lot of it was moving in one direction. The Chinese partners didn't really feel that they had anything to learn from the Zambians. And the Zambians themselves didn't feel that there was anything they needed to teach the other partners. It was about what everyone, as they said everyone knows what they want. And so in terms of the learning, though, I did feel that I think it's related to something Emma has written about the Southernization of development, where a lot of DAC donors have seen the potential in using development cooperation to facilitate like commercial opportunities and investment opportunities more explicitly from projects, instead of just saying it's all about altruism. So I think because Denmark was doing this through this project, it has somehow learned, maybe not just directly from this project from China, but more generally in terms of how South-South cooperation works. And this project was really a test case for Denmark to support trilateral cooperation and South-South. So I think that's what it was. It was also trying to learn from that. How does this work? Yeah. Anyways, I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Thanks, Cynthia. Have a question from Pippa and then Jennifer. Jenny.
Okay.
Pippa, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Cynthia, for such an interesting presentation. So I have a question about another question following on from the previous one about recipient perspectives, and also relating to more broadly how we conceptualize trilateral development cooperation. And it relates to where Japan fits from a recipient perspective, because we kind of think of trilateral development cooperation as a developed donor and a developing donor with a developing partner, right? But Japan, certainly in the kind of sectors that it tends to focus on, for example, being more focused on hard infrastructure and more kind of willing to provide loans rather than grants, looks, as you mentioned, much more like an East Asian donor. Looks much more like China. And of course, China's development model is very much inspired by what Japan did in China in the 1980s. And so I'm just so curious about your perspective on where Japan fits from a recipient, perspective. Does Japan kind of fit this trilateral model that we have in our heads, or is cooperation with Japan and, say, for example, as Malaysia and Zambia, something different from trilateral cooperation that involves a Western partner?
We'll take the question from Jenny and then you address both of them together, Cynthia. Jenny, go ahead.
Thanks, Cynthia. That was absolutely fascinating. So to some extent, it follows on from the two other questions. So in a way, how much do you see this being sort of it's not new, but the renewed normal in how these different partners with quite different interests engage? Is TDC, are we going to see the continuation of TDC for the long haul? But then also, thinking about sort of institutions versus individuals, how much of this, and you've alluded to this, but I'd be interested in hearing more, how much of this is sort of led at an institutional level, for example, on the side of Denmark? So is it formal strategy, which is really rooted to kind of foreign policy interests and kind of wider political and commercial interests, which it is, but is this formally done? Are there sort of strategy documents that underpin this? And how much of it is actually a bit more of a kind of a learning by doing, or we're kind of essaying or trying this approach, and it's led more by perhaps individuals who are more sort of mid to high level, if you like, within within Danida and JICA, for example. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Cynthia, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think I'll start with Jenny's question so I don't forget. I think you are kind of right in terms of who has this kind of vision about, especially the commercial interest, the foreign policy interest. It really is like mid to senior level officials who are very aware of what the strategy is. In terms of policy documents, I did find in Danida's, I think it's Strategy for Development Cooperation in 2012, it said explicitly that it needed to forge partnerships with Southern development actors such as China, India, Brazil, and the Gulf states, specifically because it was a way to remain relevant in the global development. It actually stated that. I don't think a lot of, I guess, maybe the development practitioners who are working for Danida would be involved in the actual implementation project. They don't think in that way when they are working in these projects. But the people who were involved in negotiating the projects and developing these were more people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like for the Danish Ministry of, they had this vision. So that was really important. And I think even for JICA, for Japan, the people who are at the top, they're the ones who have this very clear vision of what they want to be achieved from the project. And when I did look at Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs documents, it also did state clearly what the vision is for trilateral development cooperation and really positioning itself as the facilitator. So I did find that it is a bit more, I guess, at a more national level or global, like at the institutions, the senior people are the ones who have this vision. Yeah. And then I guess for Pippa's question about Japan. So Japan was it was really interesting to find that, I guess from the beneficiary perspective, Japan was unique. So I found a lot of the key stakeholders that I interviewed from the Zambian side, they saw Japan as a developed country. They did see it some actors did see it as a northern donor, but others felt that the global South was any country that was not a Western country as part of the global South. So there was a little bit of confusion about who is Japan, but I found for a lot of the actors, they did feel that Japan is probably the one country that is not part of the West, which they actually considered part of, I would say, the global north. But I think countries such as maybe like South Korea, which I think it identifies itself now as part of the global north, I found they considered it part of the global South. They didn't see South Korea as a northern donor, even though it's now part of DAC. So that was really interesting and it made it a bit harder to kind of research because I found the Zambian stakeholders, they were even contesting the concept of trilateral development cooperation. The only ones who were really willing to engage in that, using the concepts of trilateral cooperation, they were the more senior level civil servants or some of the people who are involved in directly dealing with donors, but people who are involved in the actual implementation level, they were just like, this is just any other development project for us. This is not triangular. We do a lot of work in renewable energy with northern partners, southern partners. And in Zambia, they actually prefer to use just the whole idea of developed and developing country instead of using northern, southern. It's very, very rare. And I got a lot of pushback when I was trying to use those kind of concepts. They just said, no, we don't use those concepts. Yeah. And even when it comes to hierarchies, for example, when I was introducing trilateral cooperation, I said a North-South-South partnership, and they just said, stop there. This is a South-South-North. The North is a minor player here. So yeah, it was really interesting.
Super interesting, those details on how concepts are perceived, Cynthia. So I just want to use these last 5 minutes for us to, as a group, reflect on whether at this point in time, we are at a turning point with regards to the rising powers, either considering lending or considering trilateral cooperation. So I wanted to invite Pippa and Cynthia to just share any quick thoughts, and then the rest of the group on whether you feel the shock we're all going through right now, whether you expect this to have an impact in the area where that you've presented about. So in your case, Pippa, in terms of lending patterns, whether we might see some changes there, and Cynthia, in terms of TDC, whether the sort of competition that you have observed from within are likely to intensify, or and transform the way in which trilateral development cooperation is used by the different players. So, Pippa, would you like to just some quick thoughts?
Sure. So very quick thoughts. I actually see, certainly in the case of lending from the BRICS and from China in particular, which is the most important one, probably around the turn of the century, to be much more important than the current moment. And I'm not sure that I really see Chinese lending practices changing a lot in the coming years. Not to say it won't change at all, but if you look, for example, at the response to COVID-19 debt problems, they're responding in very similar ways to how they've done in the past, couple of decades, in terms of basically not being very willing to cancel debts, but being willing to renegotiate, but doing that in a relatively secretive way. And those patterns are pretty similar to what we're seeing now is pretty similar to what's happened over the past couple of decades. So I haven't seen any evidence of being at a big turning point at this moment.
Okay, I think just a quick thought in terms of will the competition get more intense? I feel that possibly one thing that will happen, I think China, obviously economically, it's managed to kind of ride over this COVID pandemic. So it'll have a lot more money to dedicate towards development cooperation. I've seen for the renewable energy project that what it's doing now is developing its own best practice that it wants to transfer to other countries. I actually think it might possibly move from being a pivotal partner in trilateral cooperation to positioning itself as a facilitator. So I think that'll be the interesting thing to try to see how things will be changing in the next few years. Yeah.
Thanks very much, both. And I would like now to invite any comments, reactions from the rest of you before we close. Anyone willing to share a thought? Those of you who haven't spoken, perhaps? Clem, welcome.
Hi, I have to apologise. I'm here as Clem, which is actually my son's name.
Oh, sorry. Clem's mum, welcome.
I don't know what he's done to my computer, so I'm coming up as him. No, I just wanted to say how interesting I found it, really fascinating. And something I particularly like is the interrogation of Southern knowledge has been such a shorthand when we talk about the hierarchies of knowledge and global North and global South knowledge. And it just seems to have been insufficient disaggregation of Southern knowledge. And it's really, really fascinating to, I was loving hearing Cynthia's inside story about how Zambia are actually viewing their particular situation. And that's just something that I wanted to mention, is how refreshing and eye-opening it was to really hear people starting to interrogate these ideas of this block of Northern knowledge and block of Southern knowledge, and not properly unpacking what's meant by those. So yeah, massive thanks, because they were fascinating.
Thanks very much. That's a really useful thought there. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Thank you, Alex. Thanks for joining. So if not, it's now 4 o'clock and you probably have other things to do and the conference goes on. But let me just remind you that we'll have another 2 sessions tomorrow on this panel. The first one at 10 o'clock, looking at different aspects of China's footprint in international development. I have a meeting starting, actually, just realized. And then we have another afternoon session on different aspects of how the COVID pandemic has impacted the rising powers and the ways in which they are engaged in international development. So I hope to see many of you tomorrow, and have a great rest of the day. And thanks again for joining this session. Thank you. Bye. Thanks to the presenters for wonderful presentations and discussion. Thank you. Bye.